Well, listen, let's get right into this because how much time do we have, by the way, Terry? What's your schedule like today?
It's pretty open.
Yeah, we got like 20
Excellent.
minutes, 30 minutes. We'll be good.
Oh, yeah, 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 for sure.
Oh, perfect.
Awesome.
Because there's so much to talk about with you. In fact, let me get started with this one. It's the exit stage left, and we talked about it on the phone. This is a show that I went to. I was in the audience. I saw Max Webster and I saw Rush. You took the tape back to Morin Heights and you fixed it up a little bit. Talk to me about recording that and capturing the band live because they weren't happy with the first live album, so they wanted to sort of make this one perfect, I guess.
Yeah, okay. We it was recorded in a number of different cities: Ottawa, Vancouver, Toronto, and yeah, I think that's about it.
Ireland too, wasn't it, or somewhere in Scotland or
We did some stuff in the UK. We did
right.
Glasgow and London, but I'm not. I don't remember how much of that we actually used for that particular album. It's a long time ago.
Mhm.
It certainly is.
I didn't
Um,
make notes.
yeah. So then, how much of it is fixed in post production?
Oh, not a whole lot, as I remember. We
Mm.
Right,
were
right.
very careful to choose. I mean, we had a lot of material to choose from, a lot of nights that were recorded. So went through it all, and we chose all the best takes. Yeah.
Hmm. So I'm wearing my Le Studio Morin Heights shirt, which is kind of hilarious because at the radio station, our main broadcast engineer, Kim Bickerdike, worked on a session with you guys in 1978. And he was telling me the story how on the song Natural Science, it was you and Kim. You went down to the water and you both were recording yourselves playing with the paddles, getting the paddling sound on the song. And he was like, put on Natural Science. So we are listening to it and we are listening to the songs. And he was like, right there, that loud splash. That's me. That's me on the paddles right there.
Oh my goodness. So many of these little details just sort of get, dare I say, washed away.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But I thought it was hilarious. I was like, damn, like, there's just so many cool little things like that that happen on records that people aren't necessarily aware of. And then here I am, almost 40 years later at the radio station, a 27-year-old kid, and the engineer's like, that's me playing the paddles on the Rush album. Like,
Wow. I would have to go back and revisit that to even clarify it.
think about it. Yeah. So he gave me the shirt. So he's like, oh, you got to mention that to Terry. I doubt he'd remember. But, anyways, we were there and we did that.
Oh, we
So
had some great times at the studio. It was beautiful.
what was it about working at Le Studio that just made it so integral to the process of recording those records at the time?
Well, it was, you could see the daylight because the studio had big windows, as you probably remember from the videos.
Yeah.
And the control room, too, had windows that opened up to the outside. So you could watch the day go by. It was quite different from working in a studio that was in a like a basement or completely enclosed, which most studios are still to this day.
Yeah, super
So it was a
isolated.
big
You're in the
difference.
middle of I know a lot of studios now, they're almost like in the middle of corporate buildings with no windows around at all.
Well, exactly. Yeah, yeah. So it made a huge difference to the dynamic of the day, because you knew where you were during the day, as opposed to, I mean, I can remember being in some studios when I would come out at like 5 o'clock in the morning and go, oh my God, 5 o'clock in the morning. You have no idea how time flies by.
Right. Moving Pictures is celebrating the 40th anniversary this year,
Yeah.
and I was reading that the band, you guys went into the studio and you just got the big, like 40 track console. But I don't know if it was like an SSL or something like that, and like the technology was just so new at the time that it even took you guys some time to get used to it.
Well, to a degree, yeah,
Right.
certainly from a mixing standpoint for me,
Mhm.
it took me a little while to get my head around it. But the recording of the album was done, the way we would normally do it. We were using Neve strips or small Neve console to get the front end on the for the drums, and so nothing really changed there from a
Mhm.
production standpoint.
sonically though, going in to engineer the record, did you have a template in like sound in your mind, like, okay, we need to use the Neve strips, we need to use, a U47 on the kick, or a FET
Oh, yeah,
47?
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's, certain microphones that I love to use, and the Neve strips was a really important part of that fatness in the drum sound. And yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
When you're recording those drums and capturing those guitar tones and vocals, I've always been curious about this. How much say does the band have in the sound of the record compared to the producer? Say you want like a really fat snare sound. Are you and Neil going to have a discussion in the studio like, nah, I don't want a ton of reverb on my snare, or I don't want my drums to be gated reverb and all these things?
Well, neither of those things did we do, but
Mhm.
but I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
Uh, but we talk about, like which snare to use, and and how what kind of sticks, whether you use the butt end of the stick or the the regular the grip,
Hmm.
and stuff like that would be talked about. But generally speaking, he always had a really good handle on where he was going with things. So he'd always give me the best sounds, and then it would be a question of, can we make it better? I
Right.
mean, he had a great sounding kit. He had a great drum tech on hand all the time. So heads were changed, and everything was like tip top. It was like having a drum tech on a recording session makes so much difference.
Yeah. Was there ever an instance where you're sitting there, you're like, what, I think that clear head might be a little too dull, and they just give you a look like, eh?
Well, no, we talked about heads, but I mean, he had, he had preferences that he liked to use, and those things change from, as you go through recording techniques, those things change over the years, and different heads were coming up,
Right.
like, you know, oil, double-headed, double
Yeah.
skin with oil between them, and or single heads and clear bottoms and frosted tops. So yeah, there's all kinds of different combinations, but each drummer will come up with something that is gives them the sound that they want.
Right. Because that record, I mean, everybody still to this day, between Tom Sawyer and YYZ and Limelight, I mean, it's like those drum sounds are iconic now that Neil's gone. And like, even just listening to the record, like, I'm just curious, just reading up on the record and just being a fan for all these years, the songwriting process for the record, it was mostly done on the road, and then you did demos, and then you went in to record the actual record.
Basically, yeah, they used to record their sound checks. So
Mhm.
during sound check, they'd be jamming on riffs and ideas that they were thinking about and working on, and and then that would get written into tunes, and then we'd go in and do demos.
Right. So you're
Yeah.
not sitting there in the studio kind of like Mutt Lang and picking out like riffs like, oh, you heard the riff for Limelight, like, oh, that could be a huge hit, let's hold on to that riff. Or like, did the band already came in with the songs, or?
Yeah, at that stage, yes. I mean, when we first started working together back around Fly By Night, um, then certainly there were things that we would work on a tune. It'd be like, you know what, we need something else for the bridge. The bridge isn't really happening. Let's come. I mean, Alex or Ged would say, well, what about that thing we were working on when we were on the road in, Timbuktu? And and we'd try it, and then we'd make some changes, and then we'd put it into the tune, and sure enough, hey, that's much better than what we had, so let's go with this. So
Right.
yeah, but by the time we got to moving pictures, it was much more set before we went in, so everybody knew what their role was in terms of parts to lay the tracks.
Right. Well, let me take you just real quick back to the beginning. You start off with Mo Kaufman, who's a flautist, and then eventually you do Rush, and then eventually you do Voivod. How did you get into production? Are you a musician that just couldn't get a deal and you said, I'm going to produce? Or were you always like, well, I really am interested in the sounds and how we get the sounds? How does the career start, and how do you go from a flautist to a progressive to basically death metal? I mean, that's quite
Death metal band.
it's
Well,
quite a leap.
although, yeah, incidentally, the Angel Rat
Yeah.
has just been remastered by Peter Moore.
Oh,
and
wow.
it sounds absolutely stunning. I was so thrilled when I heard it.
Oh, wow.
I never heard it sound that good. We never quite got it to sound that good. And CDs were, fairly new in those days.
And those,
So
Hmm.
now, was it remastered or remixed?
it's remastered. It wasn't remixed. It's my
Okay.
original mix,
Mm.
but it's remastered and for vinyl and CD, and it sounds fantastic.
It sounds great. Okay, so how that I'm going to have to check out. But
Yeah.
how do you get into production? Because a lot of times you talk to a producer and they go, "Oh, I'm a failed musician, but I was hanging around the studio and and I gave my opinion, and they said, oh, I like that opinion." So,
No, that wasn't the way it happened for
okay,
me. I mean, I started working in the studio when I was like 18, 17 and a half, 18. But I started working with some amazing people right off the bat, like Ginger Baker and The Who, and,
Right.
like all these different musicians who had a huge influence on what I was doing. And, but I was an engineer, and I was tape hopping originally and then engineering, and then came to Toronto in '69 and with Doug Riley and started Toronto Sound.
Mm.
And so I was still an engineer basically, and that's my background. I mean, I played piano when I was a kid, but I'm not musically inclined in that way. So
Mm.
I never became a musician.
So
You know,
you really enjoyed being on the floor and moving those microphones around and turning the knobs and
yeah, and arranging tunes and and recording bands and getting sounds and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, definitely. But one day I was working with a band in Toronto, and I was putting so much energy into the production of this track
right.
as the engineer. I just went, you know what? I got to stop doing this. I got to stop being a producer. This is crazy. I'm giving so much away as an engineer. And and by the time you paid all your expenses, the studio was breaking even over a year. So I started producing.
you were able to charge more.
Well, at that stage, it was, believe me, it wasn't a lot, but it was just the fact of building a career. I got my name on the record as a producer, which was fair,
Hmm.
and one thing led to another, and hey, there
So
you
then
go.
talk to me just real quick about establishing that Rush sound when we go back to Fly By Night, because the band's out on the tour with Kiss, they're touring with Kiss and they're opening and they're working it. They're in a van and they're working it. Talk to me about that sound. Did they bring that to you? Did you help create it? When you get to Fly By Night, how much is, when you talk about Mutt Lang albums are Mutt, and Bob Ezrin albums are Bob. Is Fly By Night a Terry record?
Well, I mean, at that time, yes.
Okay.
I mean, I do have, excuse me, I do have a sort of a signature way of doing things, I think, to a large degree. So, yeah, there was a lot of things on that record that were, you know, things I wanted to hear and wanted to have performance wise, I think, and we managed to pull it together. Can I
Yeah.
say it's those records were done in a very short space of time. So, there's a lot of me on there because a lot of decisions were made really quickly, and I was engineering and mixing. So,
Right. So to go back to talking about writing the songs on the road and stuff for Rush, it's like by the time they got into the studio, they were already well rehearsed and they had the songs down pat. Was that a budget conscious decision for bands at the time to have been really rehearsed, written everything, and then they get into the studio and use as little time as possible? Because now it's like, people could take 3, 4 years to make an album because they're recording in their house and stuff and they have all the technology, but was it really about the budget at the time that made bands record these things just so quickly?
no, I don't. I mean, budget had something to do with it, yeah, but that wasn't the modus operandi at that point. Um, they would, they didn't have a lot of time
Hmm.
because they were on the road all the time. So when they came into the studio, we were given, a couple of weeks for Fly By Night. I think it was 2 weeks from start to finish. But we
Hmm.
worked diligently. We worked long hours, and we worked very efficiently and got it done.
Right. You just talked about the remastering of that album and stuff, and just looking back at all the records. I mean, Bob Ludwig had a big play, in the mastering world at the time. Talk about how important it was to have Bob Ludwig master an album for you.
It was very important because he had magic fingers and great ears. He knew exactly what to do and how to get the best onto the vinyl. And in those days, it was no easy task. So yeah, it was important to have him do it.
It
Now,
really was.
yeah, but talking about the mastering, it's like how once it comes off the board to the mix to the master, how different does it sound from the mix of the record to the mastered version of it?
Well, that depends on the mix.
Mm-hmm.
To be really honest with you, I mean, nowadays the requirements for mixes is much more stringent for somebody like myself. When I send a mix out to somebody, they expect it to sound like the finished record.
Right.
Back in the days of doing the earlier, work with Rush, I mean, I'd get it to a point where I was happy with the mix, but Bob would always put the icing on the cake. And
Mm-hmm.
so when he mastered, he would make it sound that much better.
Bob was.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think mastering is a bit of a lost art form now in these days?
Well, not really. I mean, as I mentioned, Peter Moore just did my remastered the mix of Voivod and did an incredible job. I mean, it sounds absolutely stunning. So no, it's not a lost art.
Yeah.
But like everything today, there's a million ways of skinning a cat. You can send your tape in and have it mastered by an AI system, and get it back in 20 minutes, and it's mastered. It's done. And in some cases, people are totally happy with it. I haven't actually tried it because, I like to work with somebody who really knows what they're doing and can make, subtle changes to stuff that I've spent months working on. I don't want to have it mastered in 10 minutes by computer.
Well, that's it. It's like I read this classic interview with Mike Shipley, and they were talking about this Maroon 5 record that Mutt Lange had produced. And they spent like a week on a mix, and like, oh, it sounded great. They had this fat bottom end carved out. It was amazing. And then they shipped it off to Universal, and the in-house mastering guy just butchered it. And it was so bad that they tried to recall the record and everything. And that's when I started to really think about mastering. Yeah. And looking at all the stuff that's just brick walled now. I mean, like I'm in Top 40 radio, and we get these singles off DMDS every day, and it's just like brick wall the whole way through.
Yeah.
And
it's the new way to go. I just want to go quickly back to Fly By Night, because before that, the band had John Rutsey in the band as the drummer. Did you ever see the band with John? Had you worked at all with John before the change? And
I produced 2 or 3 tunes on their first album.
Oh, okay, because the credits say Rush. It never says Terry Brown on that first record.
Well, I was hired as an engineer. I
Gotcha.
Basically mixed the record.
Oh, that's right.
But I cut 3 tunes with them, as I remember. Finding My Way was one of them.
Right.
And that's what made me fall in love with the band. I just was so blown away by the way they sounded.
So that
and Alex and John was more than a good drummer at that point for that album.
Right.
But, certainly when Neil came along on Fly By Night, it was like a huge change up.
Yes, yeah, right. So just quickly talk to me about that impression. I mean, they say we're going to get this new guy. Neil comes in, and of course, at that point, he's not Neil. He's not Neil that we know. He's just the new guy. Do you listen to him and go, "Oof, okay, we have possibilities"? This guy, okay.
He was amazing. Back then, I mean, he had done his homework and was a great player even back then. And he played in a lot of other bands, progressive bands, and he done his due diligence.
He was great, and it obviously was a game changer for the band. I mean, it just took
Yeah,
what the,
yeah. Not least of all from a lyrical standpoint, because the style of writing just changed dramatically.
so in terms of producing them, did that just make life a lot easier? You could just go, hey, we got Neil here.
Easier and harder. I
Right.
mean, he had a lot more drums. He was a lot more technical, and a lot of nuance that needed to be brought out. And so there was quite a challenge.
As
Well,
an
okay.
as an engineer, is that a task when you're working with that many drums and that much sound going on and trying to fit it all into a mix? Is that a
Well,
task?
it is if you don't know what you're doing. I
Right.
mean, if you've got the experience, it's not that difficult. It's just a question of doing it properly. And I mean, even I've been working on some stuff recently that's got 3 times as many drums on it as Neil had. So I mean, it's like it just doesn't stop. It just keeps getting more
You
and
mean
more.
you're still recording real drums? You're not using addictive drums, Terry? What is this?
Yeah, unfortunately, I still love drums.
Yeah, you
But I mean,
can't beat that.
look at a picture of Terry Bozzio, for instance, sitting in front of some of his kits. It's hard to count the number of drums.
Yeah.
There are so many.
It really is.
Yeah, you even look at like Mike Mangini in Dream Theater and like his
Yeah.
kits, like it's over here and then you're up here. It's like
But when you're recording Neil, at any point do you just say, "Hey Neil, just get a hi-hat and a snare and let's just make it simple." Or was that sort of intricate drum sound just so essential to what they did that you just had to have it?
Yeah, I think you'd have a hard time cutting some of those tracks with a kick and snare
mhm.
and a hi-hat and maybe one crash. I mean,
Yeah.
certainly you could do it, but
It just wouldn't sound right. I mean,
it would just be, yeah.
Can you imagine the Charlie Watt sound in Rush? Come on. That'd be kind of fun.
yeah. Well, hey, you got my radio engineer's paddles on Natural Science Permanent Waves, so there you go.
go.
I do want to take up on that paddle thing for a second. You go back to the records and you hear Judas Priest where they had cutlery and they had to create the sounds. Now we don't really do that. We go, oh, I need a sound like this. You click a button, no, click another. How creative and how difficult sometimes was it to get those sounds?
Not that difficult. I mean, if you have to be able to come up with the sound in your head first
Right.
and decide what it is you need, and then you just go out and do it. And I still do that. If I need a sound, unless it's an F1, jet that needs to be for real because it's seen in a shot, then
Mhm.
obviously, as you say, you press the button and you get what you get. But I mean, if you're creating something from scratch, you literally have to do that, like Foley. That's
Right.
what it is, really.
Well, that's basically you're almost like painting a picture in reality.
Yeah, of course.
So you're still very much in favor of getting that sort of natural sound and not using the technology. I mean, that's a fair thing to say.
I mean, I use the technology all the time, but as far as pressing buttons and just calling up samples, no, that's not
Mhm.
my thing. I just don't. I have never worked that. I mean, I have used samples obviously over the years, but it's not something that I gravitate towards, in order to create something. Although, having said that, I have used Superior Drummer and done some pretty convincing programming that.
See, Terry, I knew you were guilty. I knew you weren't as old school as you play it off
Yeah.
as.
Well,
Yeah.
when I was saying that, I was thinking, well, hang on a second, I did do it. But I mean, I've cut a couple of records where we had a limited budget and I didn't have a studio access at the time I was making the records. And so I cut the drums myself with a Superior Drummer.
So I want to follow up on the use of technology because now we're into the pitch correction and the auto tune. And, a lot of the older producers will say, well, back in the day we did it this way. But back in the day was also a pain in the ass of having to cut tape and glue stuff together. So where are you in terms of the technology? Do you like sort of the old way of really having the band in there and a mistake's a mistake? And if the vocal's a little bit whatever, there's a perfection in the imperfection? Or are you like, man, this new technology is a godsend. I don't have to deal with any of this nonsense anymore. Where are you in terms of technology?
I think the technology is amazing,
Okay.
and I love it, and I use it all the time. And I have to confess, I'm mixing in the box.
Wow.
Which
Ah,
I didn't think I would ever admit to, especially on a show like this.
right.
But yeah, but I'm getting great results. It's not
Really?
compromising the work that I'm doing.
Oh, see, I
Mm.
was going to say Luddite or progressive, and so obviously you're definitely a progressive.
Well, I've
Talk
been
about.
doing digitally. I've been mixing digitally now ever since moving pictures, and
Mhm.
I've only mixed one album to an analog piece of tape in the last 30, was it 40 years?
Wow. So even like when you were mixing, moving pictures on, the 48 tracks, it must have been an SSL at Morin Heights at the
It
time.
was, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you're doing that, you got the incredible SSL sound. Was it still important to have all the outboard gear? I mean, the harmonizers were just coming out and stuff, and
Well, yeah, it could be, I mean, we used hardware back in those days. Now we're using a lot of software, but
Mhm.
doing the same kind of things, really, like using the harmonizer and, pitch shifting. And
Where would you utilize those in the track? I mean, one story I love is that Mutt Lang apparently used the 910 to drop the pitch of the snare on Back in Black to like give it some depth in the mix. And I was like, well, people were they were innovating even back then to try and create
oh,
some
yeah, yeah,
inorganic sounds. And
absolutely. Yeah. We were adding to things back then and like sorting out vocals. You could use a harmonizer to correct vocals,
mhm.
but it was very painstaking and because you had to do it note by note. So it took a long time. Whereas now you can just throw on a pitch corrector and
And
spit it out the other end, and it sounds pretty darn good.
yeah, yeah. What was one of your favorite pieces of outboard gear to use at the time?
Well, Eventide made a delay line, and I forget what it was called, but I know we had a lot of fun with that. We actually got one right at the beginning of doing 2112.
Mm.
And I didn't have one at the studio. We rented it, but that was a big part of 2112.
That's a great thing.
Wow. Hmm.
One of my friends is a producer named Steve Thompson, and he worked, of course, with Michael Barbiero, and they've done Tesla Mechanical Resonance and Justice for All, and so on and so forth. But they worked with you, or they're credited on the same album as you, Cutting Crew's Broadcast,
Mhm.
Yep.
which gave us "I Just Died in Your Arms Tonight," a dare I say iconic song. I mean, everybody knows it.
Come on,
Oh,
Mitch, sing it for him. Just sing it for him.
Oh, I can't sing, but it's such an icon, and I've actually interviewed the band about the song. But so let me just ask you: were you working with Steve and Michael, or was it one of these where one team came in and then another team had to be brought in later? And if so, how do you sort of divide and decide? And ultimately, you got the single, you got the song.
yeah. It was one of those situations where they tried to record just starting the recording of the album 3 times, and I
Mm.
was number 3.
Wow.
So I inherited some of the things that Thompson Barbiero had done, and also it's rude of me, but I forget the fellow's name who was the second producer.
I have it here, John Jansen.
Yeah, that's it, John Jansen. So
Mhm.
some of the things that he did were inherited,
Right.
and then we started again, but we used some of those ideas. And on "Died in Your Arms," some of the tracks we used, which had been recorded.
Yeah. That
We,
iconic keyboard intro, was that your idea?
no, no, it
Mm.
wasn't.
Yes, it was. Shh, shh. Just, we don't tell anybody.
But I did the rest of the record,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and it was a lot of fun to do. And we had a great time making that record.
Yeah, listen, Nick's a great guy. I
Oh
didn't
yeah,
interview with Nick, and he's just he's brilliant.
Yeah.
Just before I want to take up on another thing you mentioned. You mentioned the Toronto studio. Back then there was also Nimbus 9 with Jack Richardson and Bob Ezrin. Was that all part of the same thing, or were you two in competition? And you're like, we have Rush and we have Alice Cooper. How was that? Was it two competing things, or?
Well, I mean, we were in competition with each other to a
Right.
certain degree, but I mean, we didn't really sort of deal with it that way.
Right.
I had clients and artists who wanted to work at my studio or our studio, and Bob and Jack had people that wanted to work there, and they were producing more stuff. So, they had more of it was more of a production studio. Mine was more of a recording studio for everybody.
Mm. What's the difference there though?
Well, people would hire the studio with me as engineer, or Peter Houston, who
Right.
worked with me for a number of years, and different engineers that came through our place. And they'd hire the studio with an engineer, and then they come in with a producer,
Right.
and they'd make a record
Mm.
or cut a track or whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas in Bob and Jack's situation, they were producing quite a lot of stuff. I mean, even back then, Bob was producing Peter Gabriel,
Yeah.
and Jack was obviously producing the Guess Who, and it was all bringing in stuff that they were working on. So it was a slightly different situation for them.
It was
Okay.
interesting though that sort of Toronto was the epicenter of the 70s, and then when we get to the 80s it becomes Vancouver and Bob Rock and Bruce
Yeah.
and Jim Valance. It's, hey, Canada has a great contribution to making great music. I'm
Yeah.
going to ask you that. Yeah, go ahead.
No, as I was saying, it's incredible. I think per capita, the percentage of success coming out of Canada is pretty damn high.
It is. Well,
Yeah.
so let me just take up on that. Why is it so high though with the international artists? I mean, we have Bryan Adams and Celine Dion and Anne Murray, but why don't we have more bands that, like, why isn't Helix or Honeymoon Suite or Gowan, why aren't they super mega stars? I mean, we have all the technology and the producers and the
Yeah,
infrastructure.
well, I mean, but you mentioned three artists that were huge back in the 70s.
Right.
So, they're obviously 40 or 50 years older now.
Yeah.
So they're not going to be running around. Although Larry's playing in sticks and
Yeah.
doing a great job, I have to say. But
Mhm.
I think back in the day, the problem was that, well, not the problem, but one of the problems was that the companies were American owned.
Right.
So a lot of the directives which came down from head office didn't allow for some of these bands to really show their true colors. Very disappointing. I mean,
Yeah.
and the fact that you should bring that up. I mean, Larry Gowan's records were amazing. They should have been worldwide hits, but they were somehow
Well,
suppressed.
I'll tell you this. This is, I had a conversation with Larry about this, or Lawrence, and he said, Mitch, I was sandboxed. The record company sandboxed me. They said that you're a Canadian artist. We will promote you in Canada, but we're not spending a dime in London. We're not spending a dime in LA. You are going to be a Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver guy, and that's it. That's your sandbox.
There you go. That sort of bears out what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I've heard that from other bands too, Honeymoon Suite, and it's
Oh
just
yeah.
like, wow, it's terrible. I want to ask you about the Terry Brown sound, because when we talk about Mutt Lange, we point to Pyromania and Hysteria and Back in Black and Foreigner 4, and when we talk Bob Ezrin, we talk, Welcome to My Nightmare and Kiss Destroyer and Pink Floyd The Wall. What is sort of your sound, and is there a Terry Brown sound, and how influential were you to Rush, and do you have that sort of same stamp that Mutt does on a record or that Bob did on a record?
Well, uh, we're different producers for
Of
starters.
course. Of course.
I mean, Bob's a very accomplished arranger and piano player, and he's got serious chops that I don't have.
Right.
My strengths came from an engineering standpoint originally, and so I think I do have a bit of a stamp on the stuff that I do, but not in the same way. I tend to work with artists who have very sort of definitive sounds and direction. And then my job, I always felt, was to bring that out in those artists. And I think I
So,
did an okay job with quite a few of them.
well, you certainly did. So, if I hired you, let's say I'm putting together a band and I hire Terry Brown to produce, what can I expect? What is that like that first day? Where do you come in and say, you're going to do this, you're going to do that, or do you say, Mitch, show up with your 10 songs, and we'll go for like what is your process?
There's an awful lot of background stuff that goes
Right.
on prior to that day in the studio. I mean,
Mm.
I would listen to all the material,
Hmm.
decide on what tunes, obviously with you,
Right.
which would be part of this album, or you know, obviously that's even changing these days. But we'll talk about an album, and we'd figure out what tunes we're going to do. Then we'd start arranging them, and you know, how are we going to approach these tunes? You know, maybe this tune works great the way it is, maybe tune 2 doesn't work very well, but we like the song, so how are we going to approach the arrangement?
Right.
Then we
Mhm.
decide, you know, are you a band or are you an individual artist? Should we put a band together, you know, and who would that be? Who would we
Right.
want as our prime players?
Mhm.
Or if it's a band, you know, we've got to bring all the best
Guys. Right.
moments
Right.
By
out
the way,
Yeah.
I'm hiring Steve Lukather because you don't get better than that. I'm just true.
there.
Well,
Okay,
well,
so
Terry,
And
talk,
Leland Sklar. I'm starting off with Leland Sklar and Steve Lukather. You don't
well,
beat
that's a
that.
pretty good start.
pretty good start. Yeah.
Pretty decent.
Well, I got a question now. So it's funny you talked about arrangement. I mean, you're credited as arrangement on a lot of the Rush records. I mean, specifically, you know, you look at moving pictures, and there's so much stuff going on in those songs. Are you sitting there and like, you know, they bring a song like YYZ in, for example, and they got that big bridge section with the keyboards, and I think that's my favorite breakdown like of a keyboard section like on any record. Now, are you sitting there and saying to them, okay, we need a keyboard bridge right here, like
No,
what does that mean when you arrange the song?
well, arranging is, I mean, arranging can be arranging from scratch, or you can be arranging things once you've got a basic template.
Hmm.
And that keyboard idea was already there, but you know, you fine tune it, you know, you fine tune the sounds and the dynamics. You know, there's a lot of little details in arranging that aren't just chord changes.
Yeah. Well, you know, when you think classically arrangement, you know, you're writing out all the charts for every violin note and every piccolo note. Whereas on the rock record, I mean, do you tell Neil like, okay, right there on the third beat of bar 4, you need to do like a little China hit or something, or like, are you helping arrange it that way?
You wouldn't do that with Neil because he'd already have it in there. I might ask him to take one out, but I certainly wouldn't. No.
Right, right. But no, so you're not sitting there and saying, okay, Alex, you start with the Limelight riff, and then Neil, okay, fourth bar, and you're gonna come in with the drum fills, and then the song's gonna kick it. Like, are you? Is that part of the songwriting process, or is that arrangement?
Those are arrangements. Yeah, that's the arrangement process. And the songwriting is basically melody and lyric and
Okay.
and changes. So
So
that,
had you not been producing, Limelight or Tom Sawyer could probably sound completely different than they sound right now.
oh, for sure. Absolutely. I would.
Wow.
Right? Great songs. And by the way, Spirit of the Radio is the greatest Rush song ever. I'll just throw that in there. But before we let you go, I have this question. You work with the band for 10 years, and they eventually get to Grace Under Pressure, and they choose not to work with you. Do you at that time, are you upset, or do you like, you know what? Good, because you probably need a little renouveau, a little freshness. It doesn't hurt. Talk to me about that period. Is it one of disappointment or one of like, no, we've done what we could do. It's smart to go get some other air.
Well, it was disappointing in some respects,
Of
but
course.
in other respects, it was, I think, a little bit of a relief, really, because I wasn't really sure where the band was going, in when we were doing Signals.
Right.
Hmm.
So there were things that I was not objecting to, but I was questioning. So yeah, I think it was a little bit of both, bittersweet.
And Mitch, you're wrong. Subdivisions is the best Rush song. Just throwing that out there.
Spirit of the Radio. You can't beat Spirit of the Radio.
I can air drum that entire song perfectly, by the way.
Um,
The problem is there were too many good songs.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Great position to be in.
once you're not working with Rush and you have to start working with other artists, do you change as a producer and start bringing in new thoughts and new ideas, or do you get these new artists in and go, "Hey, this is what we did with Rush. It worked with them." So, like, how did you develop after that? Because Rush obviously changed. You must have changed as well.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't think I changed that much. I had a way of working and a way I like to work.
Right.
And I continued to do that, but with different artists. I still wanted to get the best out of artists that I could in terms of performance and choosing the right songs for their records and replacing members of bands that weren't satisfactory and adding outside musicians on situations where we, needed some embellishments. So don't think I changed that much.
I got a question for you. I mean, your relationship with Ray Daniels over the years, of course, he went on to work with Van Halen in the 90s. Was there any talks of you ever potentially working with Van Halen at some point?
No.
Damn.
Never.
Nope.
That's too bad. That could have. Would you have wanted to had you been asked? I mean,
Well, it never really crossed my mind at that point. I mean, I was busy doing a whole bunch of other things, and things were important to me. So sorry about that.
I like that. It's a Halloween theme.
The Twilight Zone.
Yeah, so it never even crossed my mind.
That's
I worked with Rush a long time prior, so for me to get involved with Van Halen just seemed like a non-starter.
Well, it could have been cool. So, just to go back to the beginning question, you went from flautist to progressive to death metal to whatever. Is producing just producing, or do you prefer a certain genre, or just sort of tie it all together? How we went from a flautist to a death metal band?
Well, I should point out that I didn't produce Mo Kaufman.
But you worked with him.
I worked with him on a lot of records, but Doug Riley was the
Right.
producer on those records, my partner. And so I love recording all kinds of bands. I mean, ever since I started my career, I've recorded rock, I've recorded blues, and recorded jazz records. So I had that experience of recording all kinds of different music and relating to different players and being able to record them properly. Thank goodness. So, from flute to heavy metal didn't really, didn't seem to me to such a big jump.
Well, I think as an engineer, you just want to record really good sounds.
Yeah, exactly. And I like producing really good records.
Yeah, like working with good people, capturing good sounds. I mean, that's the job.
Yeah, exactly. And it's
perfect.
Yeah. And looking back, now looking back 40 years later, Moving Picture celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. Do you look back on that record and is there anything that you would change about it?
No, I don't think I would. I mean, it's 40 years old and it still holds up. So I don't think I'd want to go back and try and change anything.
You know what I would do? I would put Spirit Out of the Radio on it and make it a better record.
Followed by subdivisions.
Followed by subdivisions, yeah.
And Tom Sawyer. I just get everything on there. No,
that's great. Yeah. Well,
sounds like a best of.
Basically,
It is. Well,
Terry, this was absolutely incredible to chat with you today. Just total legend, and just wow, so many stories, and I'm sure there's so much. And geez, Mitch, who's that barking at you? Is that your wife? Come on now.
You gotta sort that cough out.
Well, Terry, this is so great. 40 years of Rush Moving Pictures, and of course, rest in peace, Neil. And Signals will be celebrating its anniversary next year, so we'll have to do this again and talk all about that record.
Okay, then, the deal.
Yeah, thank you so much, and sorry for that interruption. My daughter came into the room, and the dogs went barking after her. But
all good.
All right. Thank you, sir. A great pleasure and a great honor to speak to somebody who gave Canada such great music over the years.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Terry. We'll chat soon.
Okay.
All
Bye-bye.
right. See you later. Bye.